The Freedom Rides in the 1960s were a pivotal moment for the civil rights movement. The Freedom Rides arose from the courageous acts of a young black woman, Irene Morgan, in 1944. Morgan was traveling from Virginia to Maryland when a bus conductor asked her to give up her seat to a white passenger. Morgan refused to comply and was arrested and fined, but she fought back and appealed all the way to the Supreme Court and won a historical ruling against segregation in the interstate level. Almost 2 decades later, inspired by Morgan's courage, a group of activists led by the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, began a series of freedom rides in the Deep South. They challenged segregation on buses and bus stops under Jim Crow laws. They faced violent resistance from white supremacists and the Ku Klux Klan. This included beatings, bombings, and arrests. The Freedom Riders, however, refused to back down, and they put their own lives on the line in the fight for equality. The first ride started on May 4, 1961, with 13 riders leaving Washington, D.C. and headed for New Orleans. Along the way, they faced violent attacks from white supremacists, notably in Anniston, Alabama, where a bus was bombed, and Birmingham, where bus riders were brutally beaten. Despite this violence, the riders continued to engage in nonviolent protests, and their actions drew national attention to the civil rights struggle.
African Americans, since the end of slavery, have been treated in much of the country as a despised minority. James Farmer is the founder of the Congress of Racial Equality, known as CORE.
In order to understand how any Negro feels under segregation, you have to realize that from the time of infancy, he has it pounded into him that he's not as good as other people. There are things he cannot do. It builds into a man a feeling of inferiority, a feeling of frustration, a feeling of resentment.
The plan is for black and white volunteers to ride together on buses, journeys that CORE calls freedom rides. The riders commit themselves to nonviolence. CORE prepares the riders for the racial hatred they can expect.
Hey, you, nigga. You hear what that man said? You hear what that man said? You, get back there. Get back there. Get back. Excuse me. Hey. Come on. Come on, get him back.
On May 4th, 1961, James Farmer leads 13 people, black and white, onto buses in Washington, D.C., bound for New Orleans. 10 days later, the bus enters Alabama, home to the largest KKK organization in America. In Anniston, the Klan surrounds the bus, slashing its tires. The crippled Greyhound tries to escape, but a few miles out of town, the Klan surrounds and firebombs it, with the riders still inside.
The goal of the Freedom Riders was to test the legitimacy of the Boynton v. Virginia ruling, which made it illegal for transportation facilities such as bus terminals to be segregated. The riders knew that their journey would be long and treacherous, but they felt their sacrifice was necessary so that the government would be pressured to enforce the law. The group dubbed their last meal in the nation's capital the Last Supper, as they knew it would be hell from then on. At first, their journey was relatively peaceful. They traveled to Virginia and North Carolina without any problems, and all seemed to be well until the group reached Rocky Hill, South Carolina. There, Albert Bigelow, a World War II veteran, and John Lewis, a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or the SNCC, were assaulted by several white racists while waiting in a white-only waiting area, clearly displaying the unwillingness of many Southerners to put their racist tendencies aside even when the law prohibits this kind of discriminatory behavior. However, the real threat was waiting for the group in Anniston, Alabama. On May 14th, a group of white racists, which include many members of the Ku Klux Klan, surrounded the bus that the riders were on. The mob threw firebombs inside the bus and shut off all the exits, attempting to kill the riders by burning them alive. The ones that made it off the burning vehicle were met by relentless attacks from the mob, who utilized weapons such as metal pipes, chains, and clubs to brutally attack the remaining survivors. In Birmingham, Alabama, riders on another bus were brutally assaulted by racists after going in a white-only waiting room. Journalists and reporters that were there to document the event were also attacked by the racists, and it was later revealed that the city's police encouraged the mob to attack the riders. The entire Birmingham incident was reported on national television, which sparked outrage across the country. The riders wanted to continue their trek to Louisiana, but they were unable to find a bus that would take them due to their safety concerns.
Even when the violence gathered attention across the nation, the attacks made James Farmer of CORE end the rides. Riders flew to New Orleans, ending the first freedom ride of the 1960s. However, Diane Nash, an activist from the SNCC, was angered by the decision to end the rides, leading to the organization of a group of 10 students from Nashville, Tennessee to continue them. Despite their continuation, many SNCC members were worried, including Martin Luther King Jr., who publicly supported the riders but did not participate in the campaign. Needless to say, the riders found it difficult to gather funds. Yet on May 19, 1961, 7 men and 3 women rode from Nashville to Birmingham, only to be arrested. In spite of this, they sang freedom songs, some being versions of old gospel hymns or spirituals. It infuriated the police chief Eugene Connors so much that he drove them in the middle of the night to the Tennessee state line and dropped them to walk home to Nashville. However, they walked back to Birmingham. JFK himself was extremely reluctant to support the Freedom Riders due to its potential complications with the Democratic Party, Southern segregationists, and his ability to get legislation through Congress. He called them publicity seekers who attempted to embarrass him in the U.S. during his Vienna summit meeting with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. Behind the scenes, John Seigenthaler, a Department of Justice representative who accompanied riders, met with Alabama Governor John Patterson. The meeting should have resulted in the bus's departure for Montgomery with a full police escort the next morning. As agreed at the Montgomery city line, state troopers left the buses, but the police were nowhere to be found. Entering the terminal, the riders were brutally beaten. When the police finally came to the rescue, they stopped them from continuing the ride in Alabama. King, learning of the horrors, returned to Montgomery, building a rally at Ralph Abernathy's First Baptist Church, a friend of King's and a central figure in the Montgomery bus boycott. There he criticized Governor Patterson and called for federal intervention. He said, "The federal government must not stand idly by while bloodthirsty mobs beat non-violent students with impunity." A violent mob gathered from outside. Inside the church, MLK called Attorney General Kennedy, brother to JFK, who promised that the federal government would protect the citizens in the church. Kennedy assembled federal marshals who used tear gas to keep the mob at bay, later replaced by the Alabama National Guard, evacuating the people out of the church at dawn.
In response to the Freedom Rides, the Kennedy administration ordered the Interstate Commerce Commission, or the ICC, to cut back on interstate travel. On November 1, 1961, the ICC issued a new rule prohibiting segregation in interstate bus and transportation. While the Freedom Rides ultimately did not cross segregation, they played a key role in passing new civil rights legislation. The Freedom Rides demonstrated the power of nonviolent protest and exposed the cruelty of segregation, and ultimately helped clean up the interstate travel in the United States and make it more equal.